Hi, everyone. My name is Sumanthiran. I used to be in the Sri Lanka national team in 2017, 2018, 2020, and I've been briefly involved in coaching and judging since then. So I'm going to do the motion debrief for the semi-final motions of Chaps, which is that opposition political parties should boycott elections if they are not believed to be free and fair. So I'm going to go through the prop and op case quite briefly. But before that, I want to make some observations about the broad strategic frame that you should be approaching this debate in. So when you see motions that have a few different components, and each of these components may not necessarily be super well defined, in the sense that it is up to each side in the debate to do a characterization of a particular component of the debate. So in this case, elections. And when you get motions, even if the motion is about something specific about boycotting elections when they are not believed to be free and fair, I think it is helpful to kind of broadly look at what do we mean when we say elections, what constitutes a free and fair election, what are the components of elections that we usually look at. And you need to kind of be able to break down a phenomenon or kind of otherwise pretty meticulously constructed process or mechanism that is otherwise assumed to be something that everybody's taken for granted, right? So in this case, an election is not something as simple as, oh, you just go and vote. No, there are many parts to election which all make it free and fair or not so. So one prop, for example, you want to make the argument that if it's believed not to be free and fair, then the opposition political parties have very little chance of success. And so there are a few different ways in which you can show that the incumbent power or the government that is currently exercising, state media and things like that, will have a disproportionate advantage when it comes to these kind of things. So maybe they have disproportionate control over the media, as I just said, and so therefore opposition parties are not able to get their message out, are not able to criticize the government effectively, are not able to campaign in a way that is fair to them in the run up to an election. Maybe it is so egregiously bad that state has control over entire polling booths, voting centers. They can choose who gets to monitor them and who gets to count the votes. Maybe they are able to count fraudulent votes or discount areas that they know are probably going to vote against them. Maybe they have mechanisms like gerrymandering or redlining. So these are all framing of free and fair elections that will be useful to prop. Similarly, there's framing for free and fair elections that are that's framing for elections that are not believed to be free and fair. That is useful to opposition. So opposition wants to make it seem like it is still possible to win the election as an opposition political party, and therefore you should probably participate in it, even if it is not completely free and fair. Because of the fact that there are still ways for that opposition to win, or at least get some power in parliament, for example, which could still be useful to their goals. So then you want to address each of these concerns. Yeah, there is probably more room for the state to give their message through media, through newspapers, to TV channels, so on and so forth. But there is no country in which there is a perfectly balanced amount of time or amount of attention that is given to either side. A little bit of skewness is fine because at the end of the day, you're still able to get a sufficient amount out there that people believe in your message, then it will be able to propagate. I think for opposition, it is useful to have an even if level to say, even if there is some state manipulation going on to the point where they're getting an unfair advantage over the amount of airtime or the amount of media, it is still all right because there are other ways in which or mechanisms by which people are able to accumulate this information with which they can go to the polling booth and then vote. So, for example, word of mouth, and this is what's often happened around the world when there's been a suppression of free information and free press, people still know what the opposition is probably standing for, which is against the government. And if they believe that the government is oppressive, then that is probably enough for them to tell their neighbors, who tell their neighbors, and so on and so forth, who tell their friends, and so on and so forth, and the message gets out there. So opposition then runs a frame basically of saying, yeah, it's not perfect, but there's still ways to do it. And even if these ways are like suboptimal, it is still sufficient or enough to be able to meaningfully participate in an election. And oftentimes the state does not have so much power that they can just rig polling booths and things like this because there are a lot of checks and balances and scrutiny and so on and so forth. So I think this is the most strategically valuable way to spend your time when you approach motions like this, which is that look at the part of the motion that all the rest of your argumentation probably relies on quite heavily, and say, okay, I want to put my time into developing mechanisms that help this part of the case. And I think this applies to both sides. But one thing that would really help, and especially in opposition in this debate, is a lot of real world examples of when opposition parties have boycott elections, or when they might have had a choice in which it might have seemed principally legitimate to do so. So Bangladesh, for example, which is quite topical and probably the reason this motion was set, in the election prior to the current regime, the opposition boycotted the election. It didn't work out well for them, generally speaking. There's been other boycotts. South Africa had some boycotts, which led to some international attention that would be useful for prop argumentation. Azerbaijan, the opposition, boycotted the election, but that didn't do anything for them, so that would be useful for opposition. So a lot of real world examples exist. There's also imperfect democracies in general, right? So India, Sri Lanka, a lot of Southeast Asia, a lot of African countries are not perfect democracies. They are democracy in name and in structure to some extent, but they are corrupt to the point where democracy doesn't really work. So you want to be able to place your arguments in these contexts and say, right, in this country, in this way, this is how this argument or this mechanism is going to play out, such that our argument is most likely to manifest. So for example, if you're going to argue that an opposition state is just going to have a huge amount of power because they're not going to give any credibility to the opposition political party, and they're going to demonize them as people who are just extremists or whatever, then you use Azerbaijan and say, this is what happened in Azerbaijan. And why did this happen? Because the state was able to say that these people are extremists who are not willing to even participate in a democratic process, and therefore they should pay them no heed. And because of the extent of the power that they had, this is exactly what happened. And even the other mechanisms of protest, like just going on the streets and protesting or calling or criticizing the government, became less likely because of the fact that you delegitimize that whole movement. So real world examples really help a lot in this case. I think this is broadly strategically where both sides should be aiming to kind of place the debate and ground the debate. On props more specifically, I think it is also useful to frame that oftentimes opposition parties have tried other mechanisms to meaningfully engage in democracy. They've tried to speak in parliament. They have tried to come to compromise or engage with the ruling system, but oftentimes that simply does not work because of the incentive for the government to abuse their power and to not engage in compromise, and the lack of a way for them to be held accountable because of the way they're abusing their power. This is the only other alternative. So basically, you're trying to say, we've done all the other stuff. It hasn't really worked. So this is the option that we now need to take. And that's kind of frames out, if done successfully, frames out a lot of what Op might say about these are ways in which you can still participate in democracy and still be good at your job as an opposition political party. All right, so this is the one level of strategic thinking. What should I be concerned about in the debate? What should I need to frame? What do I need to characterize? Things like this. How might that help my argument? You need to be able to answer these questions in prep time and hopefully during the debate. On props specifically, I think there are two major pushes. One is, as an opposition party, you have a particular role to fulfill as opposed to any random individual in a democracy or otherwise. You have a specific obligation or duty. That is why you're an opposition party. And you participating in an election that is free and fair is contradictory to that moral obligation, and therefore you should not do it. At that point, you might as well not even be an opposition political party in the first place. And in absentia of any other alternatives, this is the one that we should revert to then. The second push, ideally, is that by boycotting, you then change the system, or you're likely to change the system, or you have some benefits that do not exist on the comparative by boycotting the election, and because you bring rise to certain mechanisms that otherwise would not happen. In my opinion, these should be the two major pushes from prop. And there's a variety of ways in which you can prove them. So on the moral obligation one, I think you can just say that the role of parties that are in the opposition is to criticize the government, to provide some counter narrative against the government, provide an alternative to the government if the people are not happy with the government, so on and so forth. At the point in which they cannot meaningfully fulfill that role because of the fact that the election does not happen properly, that means that they are failing in their meaning, in their purpose of existence, basically. But furthermore, and you can sophisticate the argument, you can say, actually, the alternative to boycotting, which is participating in a fraudulent election, is actively legitimizing the process by which the government holds on to their power because your participation in it basically is your stamp of approval. Because if you win, it's legitimate, but if you don't win, then it's not legitimate. It's not a principally consistent stance. And so at the point which you do participate in it, you are opening yourself up to saying there is some legitimacy in the process, which means that if the government wins, they do hold some legitimate claim to power, even though they should not have that claim to power because they are corrupt, because they are fraudulent. And so you're actively undermining your own role as an opposition party. This is the moral push, in my opinion. And you can develop it further if you wish. You also want to make it independent from the practical, but also prove the practical, ideally. So what is the practical? You're going to create some change. So I think there's, again, a variety of mechanisms that you can come up with. One is that you now create a normative argument that condemnation of the very system, as opposed to just the government, is something that is permissible. The fact that you now have a consistent message of saying your vote doesn't matter because the system is broken because of this government, and therefore you need to side with powerful leaders who have some incumbent power. So even these opposition party people, likely they are established figures, politicians who have got some votes in the past, so on and so forth. They have had some media attention. People know them. They can now rally around them to the point at which you can gain a critical mass, which is required for the protest and other things, other mechanisms or alternatives that you would prefer people use. And this is a call to action. It is you are showing that it is quite legitimate and permissible to condemn the whole system. Secondly, it is a signal that your vote just completely doesn't matter anymore. This is likely to enrage people because we all know the analysis about how states take away all of your rights, and this is such a horrible thing. But we have a vote to exercise to be able to then check the state, and this is kind of the social contract argument, right? So at the point at which you lose the ability to exercise that voting power, you no longer have control over your own life, is basically what you're saying. This is likely to enrage people, and then they'll go out and do the kind of things that we want them to do. Thirdly, there's probably an argument by the international community, as I flagged earlier. This is what worked in South Africa. It's basically that you're creating enough of a catalyst, such an extreme action to the point where individuals who have incentives and capacity to actually come in and look at situations where they want democracy to happen, basically. So the UN, US, UK, whatever it might be, these actors now have a legitimate excuse, basically, to come in and look around and to create some reports and do some things that actually create change because it's coming externally as opposed to from an internally broken system. I think the strategic identification for prop here is in saying there are certain stakeholders. So there are people who are against the government that don't feel emboldened to go and act against them. Now you give them, you embolden them. There are people who are on the fence and are not entirely sure whether they should protest or not. Now you're explicitly telling them your vote doesn't matter. This is likely to flip them. Or this is likely to be the tipping point for these people. And so I think breaking down the population to stakeholders and explaining why stakeholders now act in ways that you want them to act, whether it be politicians or people on the ground and different sections of people, whether it be the elite in society, how they might act, or the poor in society, how they might act in numbers. I think this is the way in which props should be approaching this motion of saying, this is how we change each individual incentive such that we now have a better functioning democracy. And this is what we want at the end of the day as an opposition party. Briefly, on opposition, I think the response to the principal argument is in saying, yes, opposition parties have a role to play in checking the government, but it is a question of how to check the government. So at the point at which we can establish that the democratic process is the best and most legitimate way to check the government as opposed to outside the system, then the principal argument falls. I'm not saying that it does fall in the sense that it's not a legitimate principal argument. I'm saying this is probably the way in which opposition should go about it, by trying to link it to the practical. So on the framing, I've already explained why it is possible to some extent for opposition parties to actually participate meaningfully in democracy, even if the election is not necessarily free and fair. First, you cast doubt on what we believe to be free and fair, because that's part of the motion. So just because you believe it to be fair, not be free and fair, does not mean it's actually not free and fair. It is similar to most of the democracies. But even if it was not free and fair, you're still able to participate in a meaningful way. That is, you are able to win seats in parliament. So I think broadly there are two pushes then from all, right? The first is you increase the capacity for state abuse. And this is just saying you are reducing the mandate for the government to care about opposing or opposition views by just not turning up for the vote. You don't have enough people voting for something. The government does not have a reason to care about it. So they don't need to care about people criticizing the government. They don't care about corrupt politicians or corrupt systems or certain policies or bills that usually people will criticize, but now they don't feel the need to care about them because it's not going to translate into votes for the government. You increase on the other side the number of seats that you give to politicians and people who want to destroy the country, basically. Or that's how Op wants to frame it, right? Who are supporting the corrupt incumbent regime. And this allows them to do a variety of things. They can now actually pass policies because they have a great amount of vote. They can change the constitution because now they have 2/3 majority in parliament. And that's the way it works in a lot of countries. There's no actual pressure for them to change if they don't care about external pressure. But now internally, democracy is now completely controlled by one individual, or sorry, one entity, when there would have been pushback otherwise. And this is something that's incredibly harmful to the most vulnerable people. I think like this is a op argument that you can really crack down on and go, again, strategic vision should be, what are the impacts that I can create from this argument, right? Like the poor, the vulnerable, the minorities, ethnic, racial, whatever. These are the people who usually criticize the government because they're usually the people who are the target of government policies and government action. They now lose the ability to call out the government internally, to actually use mechanisms that the government is forced to recognize. And now what the government can do is just just say all of these people are extremists and we shouldn't listen to them, and all the analysis I gave earlier, right? So that's one major push. You're marginalizing opposing views and increasing the capacity for state abuse. And this is really bad because of impact zone, so forth. The second push is what I explained earlier already, which is that change for democratic systems is just more likely on opposition side, because working within the system is still possible to some extent. So a lot of framing goes into this argument. But then you also want to explain how the mechanisms get better over time in the opposition world. So the fact that you might not get the amount of seats that you truly deserve, but getting some seats allows for you to get more seats later on, as opposed to the comparative when you would rather get less seats. So you create voting blocks, for example, you become a kingmaker, which is basically the small amount of people who are able to swing otherwise 50-50 voting decisions. So you become important in these kinds of ways. Or the fact that you now have people who are present at polling booths who can speak out against the abuse. You can document the kind of abuse that otherwise happens and make it such that people can recognize what's happening. So you cast a light on the problem and then create a greater capacity and call to solve it. There's a variety of ways in which you just better the system by becoming more involved in it, even if it is corrupt. You can even flip the international attention argument by saying it is only when you get actively involved can you uncover all these things and then present them as evidence to people like the UN or whoever who need this kind of legitimate reporting to be able to come in the first place. So yeah, I think that is the broad pushes from opposition and proposition. I don't want to make this too long. And hopefully this gives you an idea for the strategic frame that you should be approaching this debate. Thank you so much, and good luck for the next few debates.